I recognize the member for Kiiwetinoong.
Very good, Speaker. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge and honor that 215 children who did not return home from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. I acknowledge the communities, the First Nations in British Columbia, who these children belong to, and across the country, across Canada, those who have felt the pain of this loss. We are united in grief. Indigenous people across the country are hurting. We are in pain, remembering all those who have lost and the destruction of what residential schools has left behind. The discovery of those precious 215 lost children, our children, has shown us again the overwhelming amount of work to be done to ensure justice, dignity, equity for our people. Speaker, the death of our children is a crime against humanity. But Canada has never treated as such. The country must own up to its past, as must all its governments and institutions for its role and the horror it created in residential schools. The first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, told the House of Commons in 1883, when the, quote, and I quote, when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits, the training, the mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed upon myself as the head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from parental influence. And the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men, end quote. People often call Indian residential schools a dark chapter in Canada's history. But so for many of us who are affected by this directly, we know that chapter never ended with our grandparents. And for those other members of our families who were sent to residential schools. We continue to collectively feel that hurt that was experienced by our relatives in those schools. Speaker, all Indigenous peoples living today in Canada are survivors of Canada's tools of genocide. We are survivors of residential schools. We are survivors of Indian Act. We are survivors of the 60s coup and survivors of the ongoing systemic racism which attempts to erase us. But we are still here. Today, I'm calling on Ontario and the Canadian government to work with all First Nations at the sites of the schools and look for our lost children. It is a great open secret that our children lie on these properties of former schools. An open secret that Canadians can no longer look away from. In keeping with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Missing Children projects, every school site must be searched for the graves of our ancestors. Canada must also demand apologies from those who helped commit these heinous crimes. Pope Francis, the Catholic Church, and all other churches involved must own up to their part of this genocide, apologize, and offer reparation to survivors and families of those lost. Finally, we must remember that Canada's governments at every level, including ours, have roles to play, responsibilities, and treaty obligations. And Speaker, it's still hard to be an Indigenous child. As I speak today, thousands of Indigenous children are without proper schools, or clean water, adequate food, safe home to live in, or good health care. Many cannot attend high school in their own communities, and they are too often in the child welfare or justice systems. We can no longer throw up our hands and say, there's nothing we can do. We must act together to resolve this so no more children go without. Today, I'm calling on the government of Ontario to keep the flags lowered at all provincial buildings to half-mast to honor the 215 children for 4 days. I am also calling on the government of Ontario to institute an annual day of mourning and remembrance for those who we lost to residential schools and to survivors. Let this be a first step towards an honest reckoning with the past by Ontario, by Canada, and all people who call this land home. While we respect the lowering of flags and other demonstrations as a means of showing support for the 215 children who died at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, there is so much work that must be done to honor the survivors of Indian residential schools and to honor those who did not go home. This work demands attention of every member of this legislature, and it needs a collective action for all 124 members who were elected to serve here. All of us here must be fully committed to implementing the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address the ongoing legacy of residential schools. The discovery of the unmarked graves of these 215 children shows us against that genocide and colonization, oppression are not in Canada's past. Our people live with it, with the effects in the present. Speaker, today our hearts and our prayers are with the families and nations of these young people who did not get to return home, and with all the survivors of Indian residential schools across Canada. I asked for a moment of silence to recognize the 215 children who did not return home from Kamloops Indian Residential School.
Member for Kiiwetinoong Seeking the unanimous consent of the House for a moment's silence to remember the 215 children who did not return home from the Kamloops residential school. Agreed? Agreed. Members will please rise. Thank you very much. Members, please take your seats.